morning. We're in a series where we're doing some character studies. We're getting to know some biblical characters in order to identify emotional connections that move them either toward God or away. And this morning we're going to deal with one of the most touching stories in the Bible, the story of Ruth. We find ourselves in the story of Ruth in the period of the Judges. And so we did this last week, but just by way of review, let's understand something about the era that we're living in the time of the Judges. Between Israel's arrival in the Promised Land and the setting up of kings, there was a period of about 200 years known as the period of the Judges. In this period, there was no formalized, centralized government in Israel. Specially gifted men and women raised up by God provided leadership. They were called judges because they carried out God's judgment either by driving out enemies or by settling disputes among the Israelites themselves. It was a very, very challenging time. They lived alongside people who had lived there for a long time, and these people had their own gods, and the way they saw the God of Israel is he's really good in the desert. If you're going from point A to point B and that goes through the desert, you want the God of Israel in your back pocket. But if you were settling down in the Promised Land, the God of Israel wasn't as good at that. Then you needed the Baals and the Ashtoreths, those types of gods. Those were the agricultural gods. They knew how to raise crops. They didn't just know how to go from point A to point B. They could make you prosperous and secure, and that seemed tempting to the Israelites. They wanted to have the God of Israel in one pocket and have Baal in the other. Resulted in spiritual and moral decline that was so serious that it threatened to destroy Israel from within. And as we find ourselves with God in the midst of idolatry and depravity, instances, stories that underscore the fact that God can continue to do his work even in the midst of circumstances that seem desperate and depraved. And we find that with the story of Ruth. We're going to tell the story using some visuals. And here's what I want you to notice. We're going to see some images, and I'm going to read and describe what's happening in little cartoon images. See if you can notice how a place in the heart leads to a place in the home. Elimelech and his wife Naomi had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They lived in the town of Bethlehem in Judah. When the area was hit with famine, they decided to leave to find food. They traveled to the nearby land of Moab and settled there to live. The Moabite people did not worship God, but their own idols. Sometime later, Elimelech died. The two sons grew up and married local Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Sadly, tragedy struck again. 10 years after the two sons had settled in Moab, Mahlon and Chilion both died, leaving three widows, Naomi and her two young Moabite daughters-in-law. When Naomi heard that the Lord had provided food for the people back in Bethlehem, she decided to return. The three widows packed up their belongings. Naomi then told her two daughters-in-law, "Go back to your own mother's homes. May the Lord show you the same kindness you have shown to your dead husbands and to me. May God help you find new husbands." Naomi kissed them both goodbye, and they wept aloud. "We will go back with you to your people," they replied. "No, you must return home," Naomi insisted. "You can marry again." Naomi felt embittered and that God was against her. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and returned home to her mother's house. Ruth, however, clung to Naomi and would not let her go. "Orpah has returned to her people and their gods," said Naomi. "Go back with her." "Don't urge me to leave you," Ruth replied. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to stay with her, they both set off on the road to Bethlehem. They arrived back in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. Their arrival caused quite a stir. Naomi's grief and suffering had changed her appearance so much that many did not recognize her. Can this be Naomi? People asked. Don't call me Naomi, she insisted. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because God has made my life bitter. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has brought misfortune on me. After Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, they needed food. Ruth asked, let me go into the barley fields to pick up the leftover grain. The poor were allowed to pick up grain that the harvesters had left on the ground. Go ahead, my daughter, Naomi replied. Ruth went into the fields belonging to Boaz. Boaz was a relative of Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. Later Boaz arrived and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The harvester replied, the Lord bless you. Boaz noticed Ruth collecting grain with the poor. Who is that woman? He asked the man in charge of the harvesting. She is the Moabite who returned with Naomi, he answered. She asked permission to pick up grain and has been working hard. Boaz went across to Ruth. Stay in these fields with the woman who worked for me, Boaz told her. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. When you get thirsty, help yourself to the water jars the men have filled. Ruth bowed down before Boaz. Why are you treating a foreigner so kindly? She asked. I have been told how you have cared for Naomi, Boaz answered. May God, under whose wings you have taken refuge, richly reward you. Even though I am lower than one of your servants, you have spoken kindly to me and put me at my ease, Ruth responded. At mealtime, Boaz invited her to eat with the other harvesters. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar, he said. He offered a roasted grain. Ruth ate all she wanted. When Ruth got up to continue working, Boaz gave secret orders to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves. Even pull out some stalks from the bundles and drop them for her to gather. Ruth busily gathered grain until evening. Ruth threshed the barley she had gathered and took it home to Naomi. It was a large amount, about 30 pounds. She also brought Naomi the food left over from the meal she had with Boaz and the harvesters. Where did you gather grain today? Naomi asked. Who is the man who has been kind to you? Boaz, Ruth replied. The Lord bless him, said Naomi. He is a close relative we know as a guardian redeemer. He has an obligation to look after a widow who is in need. From that moment on, Ruth continued gathering grain in the fields belonging to Boaz. She stayed close to the other women gathering grain, knowing she would be safe. She worked hard in the barley harvest and then in the wheat harvest that followed, making sure that Naomi had enough food to eat. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, My daughter, you must have a future where you will be provided for. Tonight, Boaz will be winnowing barley. Wash, put on perfume, dress in your best clothes. Then she told Ruth what to do next. Ruth made her way down to the threshing floor where Boaz was working, making sure she was not seen. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking, he lay down at the far end of a grain pile. Ruth crept up to him, uncovered his feet, and lay down. During the night, Boaz woke up to find a woman asleep at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your garment over me, as you are a guardian redeemer of my family. A guardian redeemer was someone obliged to look after a relative in need. Boaz was related to Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. The Lord bless you, replied Boaz. You have not run after younger men, and the people know you are a woman of good character. I am your guardian redeemer, but there is another person more closely related than I am. If he is not willing to redeem you, then I will. Ruth lay at his feet until morning. Boaz filled the shawl she was wearing with grain to take back to Naomi. Boaz went to the town gate where business deals were done. When he saw the guardian redeemer, who was more closely related to Naomi's former husband, he asked him to sit down with 10 elders gathered as witnesses. Naomi is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech, Boaz explained. You have the first right to buy it, but if you do not want to, then I will. I cannot buy the land without causing problems with my own estate, came the reply. You buy as I cannot. It was the custom to seal a deal on buying property by one party, taking off a sandal and giving it to the other. The guardian redeemer, who had first choice on the land, took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz. Boaz made an announcement to the elders and those gathered. Today I have bought from Naomi the property of Elimelech and his sons Mahlon and Chilion. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabite as my wife. You are my witnesses. And then it ends. So Boaz married Ruth, and the Lord blessed them with a son. Woman told Naomi, praise the Lord, he has looked after you in your old age. Ruth loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. Ruth and Boaz's son was called Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, whose son David became king of Israel. Mary was a descendant of David. She became the mother of Jesus. It's a story of redemption. All the images didn't fit, if you noticed that. It's a story of redemption. Boaz is a redeemer. A redeemer. Tell you what it means to redeem. To redeem literally means to untie something, to release something. If something is bound, shackled, tied up, to redeem it is to untie it and to release what was bound up. That's what it means to redeem, to untie or release from. In the story of Ruth and Naomi, a redeemer releases a relative from the bonds of poverty and homelessness. It helps us to understand what a redeemer does. When we talk about Jesus, our redeemer, he's one who releases us from bondage and brings us home. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a redeemer, talking about one who sets us free and brings us home. But this is not only a story of redemption, it's a picture. It's a picture of salvation. We're going to look at a couple things, draw them out from the story, the reason for salvation and the result of salvation. Start with the reason for salvation. Place in the heart. What's the reason for Boaz's action? How did he do what he did? As guardian redeemer, it was his role, but it was more than that. Naomi and Ruth had a place in his heart for different reasons. Naomi was related, and Ruth he admired, appreciated the sacrifice that she made to accompany Naomi from her own home into a foreign place. And so he had, for different reasons, but they both had a place in his heart. And that's what we know about a redeemer. Boaz redeemed Ruth and Naomi because they each had a place in his heart. It's not just because he had a noble heart. It's not just because he was a good person of noble character. He had an engaged heart. There was a connection between Boaz and Ruth and Boaz and Naomi. He was engaged. There was something there, and because there was something there, he took action. And then we come to see that somebody redeems another person because they have a place in the person's heart. And this is true of God as well. God redeems us for the same reason. We have a place in his heart. That's why he does what he does, not only to establish a place but because we have a place. Look what it says in Hebrews 2:12 and 14 to 15. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. And again, we see redemption, somebody tied in bondage by the fear of death. Does the fear of death comprise an enslaving influence? To what degree does the fear of death tie us up? It says those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. And as God looks down at this planet, what he sees, not very surprising, is that we are in bondage to the fear of death. Would you agree with that? See, the obituaries, death is a very frightening thing. We have thoughts. Jesus coming into this world gives us hope for immortality that didn't exist in the time of the judges, that now Jesus rose from the dead physically. Said he's going back to the Father, he's creating a place for us, and he will come back to bring us to be where he is. Now death looks much different than it did prior to Jesus coming. But would you agree with me? Not all who have that hope, and even we who have that hope, thinking of death, still recoil. Would you agree with me? On this side of the cross, God sent a Son because we have a place in his heart. It says both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. Both the one who makes men holy and the ones who are made holy are in the same family. And God would regard us then as children, even though he hadn't sent Christ yet. There is a connection. We have a place in God's heart. Not merely to establish a connection, but because a connection exists. God saw us as children before he sent his Son to redeem us. Not only a place in the heart, a place in the home. What is the result of Boaz's action? Because Boaz does what he does, in what way are Naomi and Ruth in a different spot? Well, they go from being homeless to having a home. They go from being destitute to being provided for. They have the hope of a life. God's actions have the same result. He made a place for us in his home. Look what it says in John 8. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." I tell you the truth, Jesus said, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And as God looks down at the problem that exists in the world, slavery is the problem. Slavery is the problem. Slavery to sin. It's not just a lack of will. It's not just a lack of knowledge, but the presence of control by a superior power. See, slavery is when you are under the control of someone or something that is stronger than you are, against which you cannot liberate yourself. You're tied. The ties bind you. And when God looks down, he describes the issue that we deal with, not just dealing with sinful acts, which we do, but dealing with the power of sin. Sin not just as an act, but as a controlling power. You can say you can be in bondage to an act, but when it talks about slaves to sin, it's not talking about a slave to an act. It's talking about a slave to a power. So it describes sin as sin which is a power. Sin with a capital S and a crown on its head. Sin cracks the whip and makes people do what it wants people to do. And those under the power of sin cannot release themselves. They're in slavery. That's the image Jesus creates here. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And as such, then, slaves have some free will, but really, slaves don't really have free will, do they? That's what slavery is about. You can say to a slave, "What do you want to do?" And the slave might have some freedom, but in the big picture, they can't do what they want because they are slaves. And that's what Jesus sees as he looks down at the world. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And God redeems us by breaking the control of an oppressive, enslaving force. This is redemption. It is to be untied from and released from the bondage of slavery. When we think of what happened at the cross and what Jesus did, God did in sending his son, it's described oftentimes as a ransom. Ransom is one way that people are untied. So for instance, if I am your master and you are my slaves and you're worth 30 whatevers, drachmas, or let's say 30 drachmas, some of you might be worth a little bit more. So if we have somebody wealthy, Eric is wealthy, and I'm not, let's just pretend that Eric is wealthy. And Eric might, because he wants to liberate you, he would want to untie you from being my slaves. What he could do is we could settle up. He could say, okay, Mike, it's 30 drachmas per person. Measure out by how many there are. He could pay me. And then receiving this money from him, he would ransom you from me. He would pay the price that needed to be paid to free you. That's one way people are untied, right? To be ransomed is one way people are untied. Somebody pays the price and are freed. And that is an image of what happens at the cross. Many believe that's what happens, thought that we got ourselves into a mess by our bad choices. God had to clean up the mess. That the problem is sinful acts. We did sinful things. And God has to kill his son in order to pay the ransom price. The wages of sin is death. God then pays the price by sending his son. His son dies, and we're allowed to go free. He pays the ultimate price, and we are freed. That's one way to look at it. That's not the only way to look at it, and I'm going to say I don't think it's the correct one. Sin is not just an act. It's a power. It's a power question. Another image of redemption is the way God liberated the Israelites in Egypt. Tell me, are we going to find in the Bible that God paid Pharaoh off? Did he count up the Israelites? Decide how many drachmas per Israelite? Pay off the Egyptian government? Did he do that? No, he didn't. See, there's a couple ways you can redeem someone. You can redeem someone by paying the price. There is another way to redeem someone. I want you to imagine. You guys are enslaved in a foreign country. Let's call it a Middle Eastern country. And you went there on a trip. Let's say it's ISIS. And you are taken hostage. And I want to effect a rescue. A couple ways we could pull that off. Let's say I'm a very important person. Let's really stretch, okay? Just really stretch this. And I would go to the individuals who are in charge of ISIS in this place, and I would broker a deal. Now, I'll tell you what, I'm going to allow you to take me into custody in order that these people might go free. And let's say that they say, okay, we'll do that. So I lay down my life for you, and you're allowed to go free. That's one way, and you have been redeemed, correct? You've been untied. To be redeemed is to be untied and allowed to go home. Because I do this thing, you are released from slavery, and you get to go home. That's one image of how redemption occurs. Is that how God redeems people? Is that how God redeemed the Israelites? Let's say there's another thing. Say you guys are still, but let's say now I'm a military. I'm a general. There's another way to release you. Say I go to this place where ISIS is in control, and I conquer them. I defeat them. And I take the laws that they put in place that you have been charged with, And because I now am in charge of the government, I take the laws and I tear them up. Now, are you allowed to go free? Absolutely. Why? Because I honored their law? No. Because I replaced it. When Jesus came, he inserts a new law, the new covenant. And what he does, he defeats sin. He conquers sin, not as an act, but as a power. That's how God redeems us. Because we have a place in his heart, he releases us from bondage to sin, and then puts us in a position where we are allowed to go from being slaves to being sons and daughters. A place in his heart and a place in his home. What's the difference between a slave and a son or daughter? What it says in John, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. If the son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. What's the difference between a slave and a son or a daughter? A slave doesn't have a permanent place in the family, and a son or daughter does. That's the difference. A slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son or daughter does. God doesn't own slaves. He redeems slaves. He adopts sons and daughters. And when you're connected to him, you have a permanent place in the family. Do you understand that? Do you understand that? You have a permanent place in the family because of what God did, because you had a place in his heart. He puts in place, through sending his son, the wherewithal that you have now a place in his home. And death is standing between you and entering into that home. Now, death is still scary. I don't know what it's going to be like to struggle for the last breath. It will not be pleasant. What I do know is seconds after I take that last breath, because of what God did in sending his son, I'm going home. I'm going home. Because, like you, I have a place in his heart. He sent his son so that I could have a place in his home. Okay. What's our part? A slave is like Ruth and Naomi before Boaz's action. A son or daughter is like Ruth and Naomi after Boaz's action. What's our part? It says, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Three things. Believe, remain, escape. Three things. What's a Christian? A Christian believes, remains, escapes. To those who had believed him, and they trusted that what Jesus said was true. That was the beginning. They had believed. Jesus said, if you hold to, remain in my teaching. So there's believe opens the door to remaining. Listen to what he says. Understand what a redeemer is. And think about it. Make room for it. Make room for it. Make room for it. Room for what, Mike? That you had a place in his heart. And that's why he sent his son to give you a place in his home. Make room for that. You know what that is? That's redemption. That's what salvation is. God setting you free so that he could bring you home. If you gave more room for that, how would that affect you? Can I tell you what would happen? You would be set free. All of us set free from what, Mike? From being quite so afraid of dying. Quite so afraid. Do you know what's going to happen because of what Jesus did to those who believe? When we die, get this, we're going to be swallowed up by life. swallowed up by life. We're not going to go into a dark, dingy place. We're going to be home because of what he did. He made room for that. That's redemption. Untied so that you can be brought home. Hold to Jesus' teaching. You know what Jesus did, really? Jesus talked about a lot of things. What is the number one thing Jesus talked about? Okay, I'm going to give you some options. Morality? Top thing Jesus talked about, morality? Social justice? Character of the Father? Character of the Father? Character of the Father's kingdom? That's what Jesus spent his time talking about. He focused on what the Father's kingdom is like. The truth that sets us free is the truth about the Father. The Father's the one who puts redemption in place. I'm going to say, and I'm going to have a closing song. I say this, though. To the degree we understand redemption is salvation, and we think of God as a father, we're able to act as his sons and daughters. I'll say that again. If you conceive of God as a master, you're probably going to act more like a slave. To the degree, now all of us are in process, we think of God as a father who releases us to bring us home, we're in a position to act like sons and daughters. God, you're the Lord of the harvest, and you dispatch workers to the right place for the right amount of time. You're very gracious. We are so blessed that you've sent Joel and Tracy to us, that we've had these years with them. And you are sovereign. You direct them to another place in your harvest field. And we put our lives at your feet. We really do want to be the men and women you would have us to be. And so we thank you that as Joel and Tracy go, that you have things for them, things that you will reveal yourself to and through them to others. There's things that they've learned here that they're going to carry elsewhere, things you've told them here that they will now dispatch elsewhere. And we ask that you would give them everything they need to do your will. Work in them that which is pleasing in your sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever and ever.